everyone. Welcome to What is Postmodernism, the next installment of the Copernican Lens. I am going to talk about postmodernism from a variety of vantage points that match the specialties of everyone teaching the Copernican Lens, so that would be science, literature, history, and philosophy. I first want to just give you a sense of perhaps some of the context, the social context that prompted or that helped to inspire thinking in the terms that we now call postmodern. Postmodernism is very much a kind of thinking that arose after World War II. And the images that I'm going to show you are probably the images that were seared into the minds of anyone who was alive after World War II ended. The first one is this picture of a mass grave inside of the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp. I'm trying to get my camera set up here more effectively. As you can see, that's an image of the Nazi death camps that was impossible to get, once seen, impossible to get out of one's mind's eye. Another image, we talked a little bit about this last time when we talked about Einstein and his role in developing the atomic bomb. The images I have here, this is an image of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima 2 to 5 minutes after detonation. You can see it here. And here are the kind of destruction, the burn marks that radiation made. You can see how devastating that particular weapon of destruction, the very terrible damage that it made to the human body. So those two images of the Nazi death camps and of the Hiroshima, the aftermath of dropping the atom bomb on Hiroshima, very much are in the collective consciousness of anyone living during the post-war, immediately after the World War II, the post-war era. Those two images made it impossible for people any longer to believe that in the narrative of progress, both science and civilization, culture, all of it seemed to end with scenes of devastation. The Nazi war camps, the bombing of Hiroshima. And so in the aftermath of that, there was a call by one of the central postmodernists. His name is Jean-Francois Lyotard, in a book called The Postmodern Condition, a Report on Knowledge, to call to resist what he calls grand narratives. I said, no more isms, no more, systematic thinking that wraps up everything in one general framework. So what is a grand narrative? A grand narrative sees some kind of connection, interconnection between events, and that things are progressing through these interconnections to a determined ending. The two grand narratives that seemed especially insidious to Lyotard and other postmodernists were these two grand narratives: the progressive emancipation of humanity, examples being the Christian redemption, Marxist utopianism, the American dream, and on the other hand, the triumph of science, or what we call scientific progress. Another term or interchangeable term for grand narrative is totalizing narrative. And you can see that after World War II, totalitarianism such as Nazism, fascism, and Soviet-style communism bred contempt for totalizing narratives. The upshot being that universal truth is impossible and relativism is our fate. The next slide I want to look at is about Thomas Kuhn. We've mentioned him quite often, this term. I know that many of us are using Thomas Kuhn's The Copernican Revolution as one of our foundational textbooks or guides through the Copernican lens. Thomas Kuhn challenged the idea of that grand narrative of scientific progress. So if we look more closely at these different windows, let's try to get them a little bit bigger here. Before Thomas Kuhn, our view of science was dominated by philosophical ideas about how science ought to develop. Maybe sometimes we called it the scientific method. There was also a kind of heroic narrative of scientific progress, and the idea that we would add new truths to old truths, and as we kept progressing, we would get nearer and nearer to truth itself with a capital T. Another way to look at this is that what Kuhn rejected was what is sometimes called the Whig interpretation of scientific history, in which past researchers, theorists, and experimenters engage in a long march, if not towards truth with a capital T, then at least towards greater and greater understandings of the natural world. Whig history or Whig historiography is an approach to history that sees the past as an inevitable progression towards ever greater liberty and enlightenment. Whig historians emphasize especially the rise of constitutional government, personal freedom, and scientific progress. And in terms of scientific, in terms of the history of science, it can mean that the Whig history of science can mean a chain that focuses on the successful chain of theories and experiments that led to present day science while ignoring failed theories and dead ends. The progress it has an emphasis on the inevitability of progress, and as Kuhn was pointed out, it leads to the mistaken belief that the progressive sequence of events becomes a line of causation, tempting the historian to go no further to investigate the causes of historical change. And Kuhn wanted to look at history as a factor in explaining how science develops. Okay, so Kuhn's version of how science develops is very different from the Whig version, where the standard account of science saw steady cumulative progress. He saw discontinuities, and these discontinuities, the way he phrased it, alternated between normal phases and revolutionary phases. Normal phases, as he calls it, in this phase, community of researchers share a common intellectual framework he called it a paradigm or disciplinary matrix, and everyone really works within that paradigm, and they don't break out of it. If there are any anomalies or inconsistencies, they try to figure out ways to account for those. During revolutionary phases, the the unresolved anomalies accumulate and get to the point where the paradigm seems to no longer hold. At this point, according to Kuhn, the discipline enters a period of crisis characterized by a proliferation of compelling articulations, the willingness to try anything, the expression of explicit discontent, the recourse to philosophy, and to debate over fundamentals. In the end, the crisis is resolved by a revolutionary change in worldview in which the now deficient paradigm is replaced by a newer one. And we've seen this time again in this course as the deficient paradigm of the Ptolemaic system was replaced by the more revolutionary paradigm of Copernicanism and Galileo and Newton and so forth. Instead of seeing a direct line of scientific progress, Kuhn sees a sort of spiraling or oscillating pattern to the history of science. Okay, the next person I want to think about is my literature representative. His name is Edward Said. He taught in the English department at Columbia University, where I was a graduate student and where he was, in fact, my professor. This is a little bit of his background. He was a Palestinian American academic, a political activist, and a literary critic who examined literature in light of social and cultural politics. He also was an outspoken proponent of the political rights of the Palestinian people, yet he wasn't knee-jerk about it. He broke with Yasser Arafat after supporting him for decades when he came to the conclusion that the PLO lacked credibility and moral authority. Edward Said's big book, although he wrote many other books, but his most paradigm-shifting book is called Orientalism. And I'm going to explain just a little bit about that now. So here's the slide on Orientalism. So Orientalism, again, more isms. Let me get this a little bit more manageable. Orientalism, you can see, has another ism, and within that ism is another ism, essentialism, and I'll talk about both isms. What Edward Said just wanted to picked as his central aim of critique was the field of study called Orientalism, which was a study by Western scholars, philosophers, writers, artists who were looking at the East and trying to depict and make sense of the East or the Orient from their point of view. Oftentimes the East meant the Middle East, but at least in the beginning. Turkey was a special arena of fascination, and so forth. So what Said claimed is that the representations and the discussions and the definitions of the Orient that were made by Western scholars and so forth did not accurately represent the East. And in his analysis, the West essentializes these societies as static and undeveloped, thereby fabricating a view of Oriental culture that can be studied, depicted, and reproduced in service of imperial power. What this, excuse me, I'll go back again. The idea is that by fixing the East, and then by making the East or the Orient stagnant, by contrast, the West becomes progressive and moves toward a redemptive or utopian future. So you can see how Edward Said's Orientalism, again, is trying to break up that narrative of progress and to stop the grand narrative that everything in Western culture is moving toward a redemptive, salvific, or more powerful and more enlightened future. So what is essentialism? Since Said uses that term, the West essentializes the East. Essentialism is, I'll read it out here. Essentialism in history as a field of study entails discerning and listing essential cultural characteristics of a specific nation or culture. It's not something that just sprung up after World War II. As far back as the ancient Greek historian Herodotus, for example, he looked at Egyptian culture, and when he saw it, he decided that he essentialized Egyptian culture as essentially feminine and soft, and he explained that that was the reason why it was easy to conquer Egypt. Post-colonial theorists such as Edward Said insisted that essentialism was the defining mode of Western historiography and ethnography until the 19th century and even after. Okay, I gave you a brief glimpse at Said's, the cover of his famous book, Orientalism, and I am going to, what is on the cover is this painting. It's called The Snake Charmer. It's a 19th century painting by a French artist, Jean-Léon Gabron. And you can look at it, there's the vivid blue in the back, but what's most, then there's these sort of sleepy, mesmerized figures of dark and Arabs or Eastern peoples, and then this more brilliant figure of this young boy who's naked. We only see the back of him, who's got a, let's see if I can make it bigger, he's got this snake wrapped around him. Here is the old musician playing some kind of flute, which to accompany the or enact the charm that this boy is supposed to be able to perform. Okay, so this image was, as people interpreted it, one influential interpretation of this image, excuse me, this is not necessary, was by it came in a 1983 essay called The Imaginary Orient by Linda Nochlin. And she says that although the painting has a photorealistic quality, what Jérôme is presenting does not offer us, in fact, a true representation of the East. So Nochlin calls The Snake Charmer a visual document of 19th century colonialist ideology in which the watchers huddled against the ferociously detailed child's wall in the background of Jérôme's painting are resolutely alienated from us, as is the act they watch with such childish, trance-like concentration. Our gaze is meant to include the spectacle and its spectacles as pictures of picturesque delectation. Clearly, the Black and brown folks are mystified, but then she says, but we are too. Instead of giving us a photorealistic representation, we end up feeling that we are in the realm of mystery. We are permitted only a beguiling rear view of the boy holding the snake. A full frontal view would reveal unambiguously both the boy's sex and the fullness of his dangerous performance, both of which are denied to us, but not to the spectators, the Black and brown spectators beholding this boy charming the snake. The message, the mystery at the center of the painting suggests or signifies a more general one, that the East is mysterious and filled with mysterious and also perverse in its sexuality, perverse in its customs, and as you can see, the painting of this lovely young boy with his naked, with his back and his rear facing us, sort of taunts us into a kind of sense of homoeroticism that is associated with as part of the dangerous mystery of the East itself. Okay, so that tells you a little bit about what Edward Said, literary critic, how he tries to disrupt the grand narrative of the progress of Western civilization. I'm next going to turn to a philosopher, Jacques Derrida, who was very, very influential in postmodern thinking. Tell you a little bit about his background. He was born into a Jewish family in Algiers. He faced a great deal of discrimination. He was forced out of at least 2 schools during his childhood because he was Jewish. And you can read more about this on the slides. But Derrida never refused to suggest that his own background played any role in his philosophy, but it does seem hard to disconnect his background from the emphasis that he put on the marginal, the other, and so forth in his thought. He had trouble obtaining a position in the standard schools, the prestigious École Normale Supérieure, where Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, and the majority of French intellectuals and academics began their careers. But he finally was accepted into the institution, and he began his early training as a philosopher largely taking up the world of Husserl. He also had other influences: Nietzsche, Heidegger, Saussure, Levinas, and Freud. And his work, in a nutshell, came to be known as deconstruction. And I'll go to the next slide. What is deconstruction?